All right, today we're jumping right into a pretty deep theological question. What is it that truly makes worship acceptable to God? We're going to break down a really detailed argument that pushes back against some modern ideas about idolatry, and we'll be using the biblical text as our main guide.
You know, this whole entire discussion really boils down to this one question. When we're talking about worship, is it enough to just have a good heart? Are sincere intentions all that really matter? Or is there a completely different standard that we should be looking at? That's the core conflict we're going to unpack.
So, the source we're digging into today challenges a really common idea, which is that idolatry only really happens when someone knowingly and deliberately worships a false god. The thinking is, hey, if your heart is pointed toward the right God, then the specific way you worship doesn't matter so much. Let's see how that idea actually holds up when we put it under some biblical scrutiny.
Okay, what's so fascinating here is just how stark this contrast is. On one side, you've got the idea that idolatry is all about our internal psychology, what we intend. But on the other side, it's defined structurally. It's about whether or not God actually commanded that act of worship in the first place. This disagreement right here is the key to understanding the entire argument.
So let's dive into the first major point from our source. The claim is that this whole idea of good intentions making worship okay is actually contradicted time and again by some really key events in the scriptures. I mean, think about the famous story of the golden calf. Israel explicitly says their party is a feast to Yahweh or the Lord. Their stated intention couldn't have been clearer. They wanted to worship the God who saved them from Egypt. And yet, God's verdict wasn't, oh, well, your hearts were in the right place. No, it was a swift condemnation. They had corrupted themselves. Okay, let's look at another example to see how this pattern builds. Over in Leviticus, you've got two priests, Nadab and Abihu, who offer something the text calls unauthorized fire. Now, there's absolutely no hint that they were trying to worship a pagan god. So why the incredibly harsh judgment? Well, the text tells us exactly why. It was something which he had not commanded. And this isn't a one-off thing. The Bible keeps showing us this pattern. You have King Saul, who intended to get God's blessing before a battle, but his unauthorized sacrifice ended up costing him his entire kingdom. And Uzzah, his only intention was to stop the Ark of the Covenant from falling over. A good thing, right? But the result was instantly fatal. The source argues that these events aren't random. They show a really consistent principle at work.
So the crucial point being hammered home here is that the Bible's standard for worship isn't really about what's going on inside our heads or in our hearts. It seems to be all about the external structure, the what and how of the worship itself. Was it commanded, or was it something we came up with on our own?
This leads us right into the next piece of the puzzle, which is what the source calls a fatal shift in logic. This is the idea that you can take some practice that has pagan origins, clean it up a bit, and then offer it to God as perfectly acceptable worship. The argument being challenged usually follows these three steps. First, you admit, okay, yeah, this practice has some pagan roots. Second, you say, but we're just going to remove all that pagan meaning, get rid of the demons, so to speak. And third, you conclude that this new sanitized version is totally fine. But our source says there's a huge problem with thinking that way. And right here is where that logic just hits a brick wall. The command in Deuteronomy isn't just don't worship like the pagans. It's actually way more specific. It explicitly says you shall not worship God in their way. And then it's followed up by this super strict rule. Do only what I command you. Don't add a single thing. So you see, this distinction is absolutely critical. The scripture definitely forbids borrowing from the pagans, yes, but according to this refutation, it also doesn't give us permission to just invent our own new ways to worship. Just because you take the pagan out of something doesn't mean you've suddenly put God-approved into it. Now, people who argue for these uncommanded practices often point to certain stories in the Bible, but the source here claims that this relies on a really basic mistake in how we read the text. It's about confusing what the Bible simply describes with what it actually prescribes. A classic example people bring up is from the book of Job. His kids used to hold these regular feasts. And this story is often used as biblical proof that, hey, these kinds of celebrations are totally fine and God-approved. But if you look just a little closer at the text, Job's reaction is not at all what you'd expect. He's not celebrating with them. He's worried. He actually offers sacrifices just in case his sons had sinned during their parties. The source argues this shows concern, not a stamp of approval. And this brings us to such a vital rule of interpretation. Just because the Bible describes something happening, like Job's sons having feasts, that doesn't automatically mean it prescribes it for us to follow. The source's point is really simple. You can't build a divine command on a simple observation of what someone else did. So as we start bringing all these threads together, the argument really hones in on one simple idea: the complete and total absence of any command for these debated practices. And the point is, in Scripture, silence is not permission. The source points out that arguments for these practices often have to appeal to outside authorities, right? They'll talk about Roman law or what Christian emperors decided, or they'll pull verses about philosophy or testing spirits out of context. But the claim is that all of this is totally irrelevant, because the standard for worship isn't an emperor or a philosopher, it's God's law. And this is really the mic drop moment of the whole argument. After all the history, all the philosophy, all the appeals to tradition, the opposing view is still missing the one thing that actually matters: a direct command from God telling us to do these things. And to really drive this home, the source turns to the words of Jesus himself, who was quoting the prophet Isaiah. Here, Jesus directly calls any worship that's based on human traditions instead of God's commands vain or totally empty. So let's just quickly summarize the final verdict that this refutation presents. The opposing argument is said to fail because 1. It redefines idolatry by our feelings instead of by God's commands. 2. It replaces God's law with historical analysis. 3. It confuses sanitized with sanctified. 4. It appeals to the wrong authorities. And finally, it never, ever gives a good answer to the direct command in Deuteronomy 12:32. This leaves us with a final, really powerful question to think about. The source asks, if an annual celebration of Christ's birth was meant to be a core part of Christian worship, why in the world is there total, complete silence about it from God the Father, from Jesus Christ himself, and from every single one of the apostles in all their writings? And we end on the one verse that has been the anchor for this entire refutation. The principle, laid out right here in Scripture, isn't to innovate or to subtract, but to simply be careful to do exactly what has been commanded. A very clear and very challenging conclusion to a complex topic.